What do we do about the state of the world? Perhaps it always seems like it's falling apart. With the research we do, we discover that it fell apart long ago. They want to teach us that everything is progressing, but a quick study shows that things have only gone backwards. I am truly a conservative. I despise the socialistic agenda in the past and present, though I do think we should work together as sovereign individuals. I don't blame those in power for the recent control grab. I think with the death of the Queen, there's a shift taking place, a new order, and this new group is not wasting any time rolling out their agendas. What the past events in the last few years have shown us is that all nations, all leaders, are actually following the same playbook. Doesn't matter what their political standing. Free elections seem to be a thing of the past, and many nations don't even get the illusion. You're just stuck with your leader. And again, I don't blame them. It is perhaps their karma, and these people will simply play their roles. And as for me, I ask the same, that I'm left to play my role. I know I was born with God-given rights, and I will exercise those until my death. I thank you for being here, and welcome. So today I've compiled a list. It's not a complete list, but it's a snapshot of this research. The research into the old world and our true origins. So it's not in order, as that's one of the most difficult things to make sense of, the chronology. But for many, this research begins with the World's Fair. All of the World's Fairs. There were hundreds of them, and it's a great place to start. Going back to the mid-1800s, almost every major city in the world hosts some sort of fair. We're told these fairs took a year or two to build, that they were temporary, and eventually destroyed. Hundreds of buildings at each fair, and as little as just one or two remain. We have them in St. Louis, Chicago, San Francisco, even in the Midwest. And it's one thing if they all looked different or even looked like fairs, but what they look like is elegant cities with waterways and absolutely overbuilt for the population and budget of the time. When we study these buildings, we see that they're anything but temporary. The same designs we see anywhere in the world. And it is a complete untruth to say that a 4, 5, 6-story building is temporary. A building must be structurally sound to stand. And this 100% means it is not temporary. So again, if the World's Fair in Chicago resembles the World's Fair in Brazil, we must be dealing with something other than a fair. All the same time period, all brought down, essentially demolished, and this seems to mark a beginning point. So the beginning point, we often call this the reset. What we see is fully built out cities, built of brick, stone, intricate metalwork, and empty streets. Streets of mud, oftentimes brick poking up through the mud, and we see horse and wagons. Very few. Now it's the same thing in every city. The first pictures show completely built out cities with no people, as if somebody is documenting the beginning. One of my favorite things to do over and over on this channel is to read the stories of these towns and cities and buildings, hoping for a logical explanation. And what we find is hastily written historical accounts of the beginning, making no sense. With the tools and tech available of the times, there's no way these cities should go up so fast with so little people and such little technology at their disposal. Power not coming around until the late 1800s. At a World's Fair in Chicago, we're told, it is introduced, and logically this is when we should start seeing improvements in the building style, and for the most part, the most beautiful city layouts and architecture have all been created before this introduction of power. I typically focus on North America because it's A, where I live, and B, one of the youngest nations, we are told. But the same thing can be done anywhere in the world. People often dismiss Europe and say, well, it's very old. But it's no different in Europe. Same predicament. How are they building all of these cities without power, modern tools, and technology? When photography does finally get reintroduced, in my opinion, this is the kind of scene that we have. Again, a city, cathedrals, spires, and a complete mess. Every city having problems with sewage. Doesn't make any sense that you would have a whole city and still be using outhouses, unless you're just moving into this city in ruins. The ruins that we do see, we generically call the mud flood. I mean, it's mud and ruins everywhere, not looking like normal living. Giant walls and castles, domes, gold, metal, tech, and then mud everywhere. Horse and wagon people building little wooden ramps everywhere. Wooden sidewalks. Wooden shacks when they do build something. Surrounded by this. More specifically, the mud flood is talking about all the debris that has buried the buildings. Here, for example, we can see the door to this church, and the door is halfway up. I mean, are you really building this much footer? Half of the building? Or has this been repurposed to accommodate this cataclysmic event? In modern times, they are constantly discovering buildings underground. Not archaeologists, just construction workers, putting in utilities in city centers and discovering a whole realm of brick below our feet. This is the mud flood. What else are you going to call it? Oftentimes people ask me, what do you think the mud flood is? And I think that it's a byproduct of not only water creating a flood, a jolting of the fishbowl, but also some great electrical discharges that essentially cooked this realm, and all living creatures returned their waters back to the earth. All the trees, giant trees, all the creatures turning to water, buildings buried. And of course I don't know, but it seems pretty plausible. We may have some clue of this event in our mainstream history. Just like every major city has a World's Fair, every city has not only one, but several great fires. Great fires. All around the same time period, or at least at the beginning of the construction of most of these cities. In the case with San Francisco, it burnt down 6 or 7 times before the Great Fire of 1906. And I think a grain of truth has been applied to even our modern history. But rather than all of these fires being isolated. We zoom the camera lens out and see the bigger picture. In this early time period, every city, and often town, is burning. And that leads us into the construction timelines. Back in this time period, with no power and a very small population, apparently you could build entire buildings in 1 year. Buildings were burning down, only to be rebuilt in a year. And what we've come to discover is photo manipulation has been going on since the beginning. And they proudly tell us their techniques on how they would do these manipulations, usually for portraits. But what we've come to discover is that all construction photos for our history are employing these techniques. These photos are more of a mockery and a distraction to putting the puzzle pieces together. Are you enjoying your meal, Harry? Oh, just delightful. A little breezy, I might say. Well, this is a stupid job. Can I get you some more wine, sir? Now let's talk about tech. Tech in the old world is just as over the top as everything else. Again, in a time before power, we see very advanced technologies being displayed. We are told most of what we see is a lightning rod, something we don't do today, but that seems to have been so important to everyone in this time period. Fortunately, before I started doing this research, I studied the work of Nikola Tesla. And Nikola Tesla had many patented designs resembling these so-called lightning rods. And what we can see is if we do a search for antennas or vintage antenna, we pretty much get the same thing. I've proposed that even Tesla may have been a fake, essentially reverse engineering all this tech from the old world. Whether or not that's true, I believe that the information he's given credit for is legit, and these free energy devices do work and are indeed older than the man they call Nikola Tesla. And here's a look at one of those, one of my favorites. Here you can see the patent number, and to this day you cannot purchase such a device. I think a lot of inventors and authors will fall under this same situation, essentially taking credit for more than is possible to accomplish by one man in one lifetime. And I would like to see a world where we were using these technologies. Much of this information must have come out before the energy barons would hijack the system, making us dependent on their oil. What it seems like is every old city in the realm also had trolleys, and it seems like these trolleys ran off of electricity, again before the widespread introduction of electricity. And soon they would dismantle them all. Even Salt Lake City had trolleys running through the cities right from the get-go. Then they would dismantle them, and it would take another 100 years before they would bring the trolleys back. The Erie Canal was built in 8 years, digging through forests, through solid granite, using black powder because it was supposedly built before dynamite. So just crude black powder, horse and wagon, several miles per day digging out this canal, only to abandon it. Today, much of the canal is in disrepair, has been filled in and paved over. Was this older than they're telling us? Next, I want to talk about Tartaria. Tartaria is an area in Russia. In fact, it's the name of Russia long before it would become what it is today. The further back in time you go, you will see thousands of maps indicating that this area is Tartaria. Cities everywhere, towns depicted as castles, Oftentimes this research is labeled as Tartaria, and I think that's unfair. It's just one piece of the puzzle. And we simply ask, why is this not taught? Why was this not even uttered in school? I mean, we're taught about old Egypt, old Greece and Rome, and not a peep about this nation. But this idea isn't any different than every corner of the realm. Everything has a new name. Everything has a new history. It's just that they were a little sloppy about this one. They could have written hundreds of false narratives for this country, but instead they chose to omit it. And once it was discovered in this community, it opened up the floodgates. And not only do we see a complete population being settled in, we also see populations across the ocean here in America, in what would now be Alaska, and the western coast. And what can we make? We're left on our own when it comes to these histories. I mean, if it's been omitted from history, then we have to put our own puzzle pieces together. Well, here we go. Here's an old map of Tartaria. We see castles again, the symbol for a city. And if that wasn't enough, we see the Great Wall, depicted with towers, and looking as if Tartaria is putting up the wall and keeping China out. Well, it's clear who lost this battle. I should just say that I love Chinese culture. One of my favorite collection of wisdom. Again, teachings that I wish were understood by the masses today, even the Chinese. And it seems to me that the Chinese have inherited this old wisdom that is now being eradicated. Things like medicine, qigong, and philosophy, like Taoism. In China's histories, we're told that all of this great wisdom came from the Yellow Emperor from day one. And again, in my opinion, it was inherited. The Yellow Emperor was probably not even Chinese, but rather Tartarian. So of course, architecture is a biggie. Architecture that is most certainly from before these people's time. In the earliest depictions, we see these horse and wagons, mud streets, and stained old buildings. In my book with David, we break down the logistics and, in my opinion, prove the impossibility of sourcing all these building materials in the time period needed for our history to make sense. Star forts are another one that fit into the anomalous architecture, but a quick glance at Fort Jefferson, south of the tip of Florida, shows us a structure built in the water consisting of over 16 million bricks. And by now we've found thousands of star forts all over. San Francisco, of course, having Fort Point under the Golden Gate Bridge, being built with the Flemish Bond brick construction that we see in most star forts, is a great example. San Francisco has all the elements of this old world research. The fires, the architecture, the mud floods, the World's Fairs. This city is built out within 10 years, we are told, as a result of gold mining. What nobody stresses is the gold was mined over 100 miles away. There's no reason that this city should be affiliated with gold mining 100 miles away. But it doesn't matter, because it's the same story here. An overly built out, weathered city, complete with tech, trolleys, and a completely backwards people just starting out. And right at the beginning of our nation, we have this civil war. And the Civil War looks just like ruins of the Second World War. I mean, it looks like destruction created by modern weaponry and not cannonballs. But essentially it's the same thing. Every city looks like this at the beginning. And that leads us into our timeline. When we look at a lot of the dates on these buildings, oftentimes they'll be missing a 1. And if they do have a 1, it looks different than the rest of the numbers. It looks like it's been added after. And it begs to ask, more specifically, has 1,000 years been added to our timeline to make sense of all the wonders we see throughout the realm? And in my opinion, yes, the time frame has been recomposed to fit a new narrative. And I think when we look at the old world buildings everywhere, zooming out the lens to the widest possible perspective, it becomes clear that this construction is not the construction of people just beginning. It is the most difficult means of construction, even to this day. It would not even be attempted with the means we are told people had in the past. And so who built everything if we didn't build it? Was it the Tartars? Again, like I said before, this is just one corner of the realm. It is possible, but we don't even really know who the Tartars are. They talk about Genghis Khan in this region, and Khan means king, and it seems like a Khan or a handful of them were dethroned. And accepted history is much more than just history to those in power. The accepted history, whether it's true or not, is what entitles those in power to their seat. It's always been that way. And when we look at history and really study this architecture, it seems like maybe it was designed for and by a different people, a larger people. And could this be the elephant in the room? Is this why it was so important to discard portions of our history? So I think I've run out of time. I do hope you've enjoyed. Perhaps we'll do this more often. I love you all. God bless, and I'll see you next week.